This is Ashley Newby, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, cultural workers, political organizers, and everyone in between in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Black Studies Podcast. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Kyle T. Mays, Associate Professor of African American Studies, American Indian Studies, and History at UCLA. He is a transdisciplinary scholar of urban history and studies, Afro-Indigenous Studies, and contemporary popular culture. His books include Hip Hop Beats and Indigenous Rhymes, Modernity and Hip Hop in Indigenous North America, an Afro-Indigenous History of the United States, Detroit versus Everybody, the City of Dispossessions, African Americans, Indigenous Peoples, and the Creation of Modern Detroit, and his latest book that just dropped, Rethinking the Red Power Movement. So you can hear some of that about that in a second as well. Dr. Mays teaches courses on Afro-Indigenous history, popular culture, and urban studies. He works with students interested in comparative race and indigeneity, popular and expressive culture, and urban histories and contemporary experiences in the city. Welcome, Kyle. How are you doing today?
I am well. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. It's so nice to be able to talk with you. We have known each other a very long time.
I hate to even mention how long. It seemed like we were just sitting in Madison not too long ago.
Yeah. It definitely, when I was talking with Austin, it definitely reminded me how long we've actually known each other, which means that we are getting old.
No, the institutions are changing. Not that we are getting old. We are becoming like fine wine, really.
You're right. Or a good aged bourbon.
Or a good aged bourbon. There we go.
So, I would like to know a little bit more. I know we've had some of these conversations in the past, but how did you get into Black studies as a field?
Well, for me, getting into Black studies was simply about understanding, one, the experiences of Black people in the U.S. So I'll start with, for our first year at James Madison College at Michigan State, which, for those who don't know, is sort of a public policy school. A lot of the students end up going to, I think a third end up going to law school, some form of public service, public policy, education, what have you. And after my first year, I was frustrated. We read Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, which you read the Democracy in America. And what's the other one? The Federalist Papers.
Federalist Papers, yep.
And so, what was the other one?
Prince, Machiavelli's Prince.
We read, I don't even remember reading that.
You had to read that. Maybe you didn't. Yeah. Maybe you had made them stop at the but when I got there, we had to read it.
So we had to read that, and then the Federalist Papers. And I used to stay up all night reading and trying to read extra stuff so I could go argue with the professors in class. For any students listening to this, do not do that. I don't recommend it unless you can take the heat, but I was very well prepared to do that.
Yes, you were.
So we did not read the chapter, which the short chapter title is called The Chapter of the Three Races. And I went into a class. We had Professor Curtis Stokes. He gave a great lecture on how the Constitution, the early founders were basically white supremacists. And I had never really heard that even in high school. I had some sense of that, but not really. And so I was fascinated by that. The students, especially my white peers, were very upset about this and were storming off. They're like, he called us white supremacists. And I remember him explicitly not calling them white supremacists. He just talked about whiteness, white supremacy, and the founders. Because we had to read the chapter of the three races. And so, or we did not. And so I read that the night before the lecture. And I was like, how come this was not assigned to us in class? Race is an important part of understanding American democracy, history, and so forth. So from there, all the way up to the end of the school year, I did a study abroad in Japan that summer. Great experience, great time. but being a Black person in Japan was strange. Like people are cool. It was a good experience. I was like Japanese every day. Not like the weirdo anime folks who sound like anime characters when they're learning Japanese. That's a whole nother conversation. But I had racialized experiences. Sometimes I was riding a bike and people acknowledging my white peers in front of me and then ignoring me. Being sort of harassed by workers at a grocery store, and I was having language barriers too. And then I went to like their version of an elementary school with kids, and these kids were constantly like rubbing on my skin a little bit, which is a little strange. And just different instances like that. And finally, I was going to a KFC. And so right before we turn around the corner, I think this was in Kyoto, go around the corner and I'm like, I bet, and they used to have statues of Colonel Sanders in front of the KFCs. Mm-hmm. And so I was like, I bet you, for whatever reason, I bet it'd be hilarious if this Colonel Sanders had a watermelon in his hand. And so I turned the corner, and sure enough, the Colonel Sanders had a watermelon in his hand. Now, who doesn't like watermelon, right?
Right.
Watermelon's good, delicious. Chicken watermelon's delicious. But we know the history and the racialized stereotypes about Black people, chicken and watermelon. So I was so confused. And I used to want to stay in Japan and study Japanese, teach English, called the JET program. And then even talking to my conversation partner about Malcolm X and so forth, I realized then that I wanted to come back and actually study more about the history of race, especially Black people, also for the Indigenous peoples. And so that was my like initial entry point into Black studies. And then my career in Madison as an undergraduate student, meeting Professor Austin Jackson. And then later on, I'm sure we'll get into it, Dr. Geneva Smitherman. And it became apparent that Black studies was really an important part of understanding issues of race, colonialism, the U.S. democracy, and also the globe. So that was kind of like my social and intellectual entry point into Black studies.
So what keeps you committed to the field? And I think that this is an interesting question for you in particular, because you do so much interdisciplinary work in both Black studies and Indigenous studies.
I mean, sometimes it's hard because I remember giving a conference paper at NCBS, must have been 2010 or 2011. And I gave a talk about the Universal Racist Congress, which happened in London in 1911. And W.B. Du Bois was there, and a Dakota medical doctor and writer, Charles Eastman, was there. And so they shared a panel on the plight of the Negro and the American Indian at this conference. And someone came up to me and said something to the effect of, because I'm critiquing whiteness and their critiques of whiteness, democracy. And a brother came up to me, he's like, why are you talking about white people? This is a Black Studies conference. And I was confused because I think I mentioned one white person, but it was about their experiences talking about colonialism and anti-Blackness in the U.S. So sometimes it's frustrating being in Black studies because for me, you can't understand the history of enslavement or racial capitalism without also understanding the history of colonialism. And also as an Afro-Indigenous person, it's like frustrating not only intellectually but personally, because and Black people have different experiences, right? But I remain committed because the simple fact I have Black peers, Black family, and I cannot imagine a future free of white supremacy and colonialism without also including Black people. And if you don't understand the relationship between settler colonialism and white supremacy and how they have shaped the lives of Black people, Indigenous peoples, we're sort of missing the point of how those political structures have impacted all of us in different ways. And so my whole goal too and working in Black studies is to sort of bridge even more these connections that have been siphoned off a little bit, that is between Black and Indigenous peoples as a political, intellectual, and social project. So that's why, and I'm employed by Black studies as well. Like, that's these are the people uh, who pay my paycheck, but it's an intellectual and political project that has a history that is meant to, given the roots of Black studies, although it's a little bit more corporate now, to be fair, very much connected to the project of the university, but I've remained committed to Black studies because of people like Dr. Geneva Smitherman, Dr. Austin Jackson, Dr. Robin D.G. Kelly, Professor Shauna Redmond. And these are the people that keep me, all the work that they have done over the years. There's so many more too. I'm certainly forgetting names that keep me committed to Black studies as a field and as a discipline.
So I know that, one, I just want to point out that Kyle used to come to my first year Madison course, even though he was not enrolled in it, just to have arguments and discussion at 8 a.m. He would just be there, having done the
These
reading.
are rumors.
And I think that in one of because we all had to read similar texts, right? So Madison had those foundational texts that we had to read and we had to engage with, and they did have similar chapters, and then everybody would read the same chapters of the text, and you'd have your discussion groups, and Kyle would show up to the discussion groups, particularly the one that I was in with Austin Jackson, to have these conversations. And I think that like Dr. Jackson, Dr. Stokes, Dr. Edozie, the Black professors that we had in James Madison that allowed for there to be a different perspective was really integral for not only surviving that space, but like being able to walk out of that space having gained additional clarity and insight into what is so often lacking in the way that these things are framed. And I said all that to say, so I know your actual PhD, right? You're a historian. You are a trained historian. So how do you situate yourself, especially given your background, your thirst for knowledge, and you read more and write more than anybody I know, but like your ability and desire to be able to consume and think across these different disciplines and spaces? How do you situate yourself in relationship to history as well as Black studies and Indigenous studies?
So, I initially wanted to do a PhD in Black studies, and I was actually going to stay at Michigan State, but then I got a really cool offer from University of Illinois. I sound like I was a free agent in the NBA or something.
You took your talent to Illinois.
I took my talent to Illinois. It was the decision, and so what I liked about history at Illinois, everyone was involved in Indigenous studies, Black studies, American studies. And this is still my approach to research and writing today. And I tell some of my students, history or otherwise, what are your questions? And based on those questions, don't get so caught up in the discipline. As Bruce Lee would say, you have to be formless like water. Like he would critique traditional Chinese kung fu and so forth and the forms and sets. So that's not how real fighting works. You have to actually practice different things and be prepared for all situations, because that's just not how everything works. Same thing with discipline. We can be so caught up in, for example, being in the a history department, where you don't read theory. You simply only go to archives orchestrated by rich old white men from back in the day. You look at those, and that determines how you write about something. What if something you're looking for is not in the archives? Right? So, and that is the case often for particular segments of Black populations, Indigenous populations. Thus, in history, you're taught, well, if it's not in the archive, it doesn't really exist. or there's still a stigma around oral histories. Like in Indigenous peoples produce writing, of course, but there's a lot of orality to the research that one can do, especially with uh, more contemporary history. And so for me, what are your questions? And you go from there. And based on those questions, you might have to dabble a little bit more into another discipline. And that was always my training in Madison,
Mm-hmm.
in Black studies, Indigenous studies. You find the best ways to explore a particular topic. And so for me, history is a tool, just like, archival historical methods is a tool. But in history at Illinois is always interdisciplinary. Always. For my advisor, Fred Hoxie, Robert Warrior, Dave Rodiger. Um, and we used to have interdisciplinary reading groups as well. And also, I used to hang out with people who were not historians as well. And that has also fundamentally shaped my approach to whether writing on Indigenous hip hop. I rely a lot on Black cultural studies, for example, which I learned from one of my friends in grad school. And so for me, you have to listen to other people, hang out with other people in different disciplines, and then you have to go read all that stuff too. What I'm noticing increasingly, and I mean, I've heard this from even some of my very famous colleagues too. I'll say no names here, but when I heard that students don't like to read in their class, I should say classes, I was appalled. One, but two, if you have Black and Indigenous professors, which is still rare,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't care how many people you see, it's still rare, especially tenured, especially full. I always felt an obligation to make sure I go to class prepared, well read, and we're talking history. 600-page books maybe that week, and you're responsible for reading
Yeah.
it. And so not only do you have to read in your discipline, but you have to read outside your discipline, and you have to treat that discipline not as an expert, but as someone a certain level of humility, and engage with it, and read beyond just the surface level. So
Mm-hmm.
maybe you need to read 20, 30 books around that topic, including articles. And I think we're losing the ability of students is reading deeper and diving more into interdisciplinary work.
So that actually segues really well into a question that I have about like pedagogy and what we do in Black studies classrooms. So you definitely mentioned that you have heard from some of your more famous and senior colleagues that like students aren't reading as much. I too have noticed that, right? In the classes that I teach. But I know that, like you said, there was a desire, particularly in undergrad and like at Madison when we were taking classes with Austin or with Dr. Stokes or with Dr. G, to make sure that like I'm actually going to I need to come to class prepared, right? And I don't know if that was a reflection of maybe just when we grew up and like the way that we were trained at home, or if it was a reflection of the training that was provided in the classroom itself. But what do you think is important and impactful pedagogically, or even how do you think we can cultivate that desire back into our students again?
So this is going to sound silly, but one thing I actually do before every class, I ask students what they did over the weekend, and I'll go around and asking them. It's funny, fun. They tell you way too much sometimes, and I'm like, whoa, whoa, whoa. After they get comfortable, we go too far with this one. But I've seen them write about it in evals too,
Mm-hmm.
and it humanizes myself to them. that, perhaps I see them outside of simply being students and consumers of knowledge. But also, I always put students in small groups. Say it's a class of 25, 50, maybe 60, what have you. Put in small groups. I always bring markers, like the large Post-its,
Mm-hmm.
and I prompt them with a question that's related to the reading. So, for example, my Afro-Indigenous History course, what is the relationship between anti-blackness and anti-native policies? I don't know, in the late 19th century. It's based upon the reading. It's a broad question. And I'd be like, actually, can you draw something that illuminates this particular thing? And so students have a great time doing it. They get kind of silly, fun. They're up out of their seats. And that's another thing, getting them up,
Mm-hmm.
get them moving. Because in history, although I don't mind, it's like sitting in church sometimes. You just get in the lecture.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I could do this all day. I grew up in a black church. I could sit here all day and just take notes and like sit there and not move. But that's just not the reality of students today. And I even do this with my graduate students too. Have them draw stuff. You always prompt them with a question and give them time to develop it, because as professors, sometimes there's an ego that you need to know what I have assigned and we need to talk about every detail. And sometimes that's not how teaching works necessarily. It's like trying to go through the motions to get to the next thing. And yeah, yes, it's frustrating. Maybe you have to backtrack a little bit on the, like, well, we didn't really talk about this. Let's talk about it in the next class. Or there's some significant event that happened. Beyonce dropped the album. There's some police brutality. There's presidential election. Right? I'm even thinking about this as this is coming forward in the next few months about holding space for students. Right? Sometimes your plan for that day is not the most important plan. There's some real life thing that happened that impacts students outside of the classroom. And I think your job as a teacher, as a facilitator of knowledge, is to give space for those things to happen and let students talk about it. And often the things that you want to talk about around race, gender, what have you, come out in a different way. But you can still, like, you're supposed to be the skilled facilitator of knowledge. Let them talk about it and insert the things that you want them to talk about. Instead of just like being robotic in your pedagogical approach about, you should just do this, this, and this, and we're going to read this, and this is how we're going to do it. When you're an old head, you don't have to do any of that anymore. You're an old head, I'm not mad at you. Like, if you want to evolve, cool. If you don't want to evolve, that's cool too. For us, younger scholars, you still be attuned to what they're dealing with, and what's happening in pop culture. I mean, I don't even know who the latest, greatest, hottest hip hop artists are anymore, nor do I care. I'm stuck in except for the Kendrick and Drake beef, but I definitely cared about that one. Yeah. But they, we listened to them for a long time. But other things, so if they bring that up, I'm an old head, I don't know. Sure, we can play it in class if this is relevant. I probably have zero analysis, but y'all can talk about it.
That's real.
But just, in other words, just be attuned to what they're into, what they're doing, and get them out of their seats and prompt them a question, let them draw stuff, write stuff, and just be active. It can be challenging sometimes, but pedagogically, I like a challenge to do different things with students all the time. And I try to change that every class. It's a feeling, right? You prep things and you just kind of accept that maybe you won't go the way that I thought, but that's okay.
Okay. I really liked some of the suggestions that you had. I think that especially going into this upcoming school year, holding space for students is going to be so vitally important. both before and after the election, regardless. Like,
especially if old boy is elected.
let's talk about that, cause
especially,
yeah, yeah, that, yeah. I'm actually, yeah, that's one of the things that we're thinking about for prepping, like more formalized space, right, for students to be able to think about the different issues that are related to the election and ask questions and learn more prior to it happening is one of the things we're working on for the anti-Black racism course this fall. So
good luck. And this would have been fascinating if we were in Madison right now.
it would have been
And
wild.
the probably more negative ways. I mean, I would have had fun. I know I would
Yeah,
have had fun.
it would have been wild to have. Yeah, I mean, to go through this particular time while you're reading the Federalist Papers, while you have to engage with all of these old dead white men who founded this country, supposedly. So yeah, speaking of that, the past. What interests you or excites you most about the past of Black studies, and what critiques might you have about the past of the field?
What interests me the most about the past of Black studies, so okay, so formed in the late '60s. I I still, I mean, this is preceding the actual formation of Black studies as a
Mhm.
form of academic discipline. The one thing I've always been fascinated by was W.B. Du Bois when he was in Atlanta, and he had like a kind of a research center, and he thought that the point of academic study, we'll say Black studies, like honestly, that they should study a particular policy issue in addition to history, but a particular thing affecting the Black community during that time. I think they did like a solid 6 or 7, and then kind of funding and other things got cut off. And I'm like, this would still be relevant and great today. So whether it's things around transphobia, whether it's things affecting uh, like children, what have you, whatever policy thing that exists, and things that we could easily do right now. But we need, kind of a vision, the money to do it, the vision and researchers. The researchers exist, but we have to get away from careerism. And I understand, like, you write things for promotion. Like, academia is not a savior thing, not even in Black studies. It's a job. We're workers just like everyone else, exploited under capitalism. They'll exploit it a little differently.
Yeah.
There is exploitation, but for the the tenured folks like myself, we're not the most exploited people in academia. To be
A little less exploited.
to be clear, like there are issues, but you're not the, especially at a major R1 university like UCLA or the Ivy Leagues, or these coastal privileged academic spaces, in a very deeply blue state, et cetera, et cetera. So I always found that really fascinating that Du Bois would spend that much time trying to focus on particular policies or social, political, economic things impacting Black people. The other thing is understanding the history and the impacts of what now folks are calling racial capitalism within Black studies. It's still not done enough that in a way that I think it should be. You still have folks, Peter Hudson, Sharice Burton-Stelly, Professor Robert E. D. Kelly, of course, the OG Cedric Robinson, who have done a lot of cool things on this sort of subject matter. There are many folks I'm forgetting also in South Africa as well. We still need more of that analysis. And I'm not saying academics are leading any revolution. I don't want any academics leading any revolution at all, as well. But shout out to Walter Rodney too. He was legit, though. But you still need more analyses of how racial capitalism impacts historically Black people, but also today, like more political economy. And it doesn't have to be numbers and charts. Like there's so many ways to analyze how capitalism has and continues to impact Black people. So I think digging up more of that sort of stuff is important. But also, I'm going to tie in Indigenous studies here. More histories of how Black people understood colonialism, decolonization, and so forth. So, like one critique of Indigenous studies, I always ask them, what about Africa or Black critiques of colonialism? They got everybody and their mama from the Nordic country, Indigenous people there, Indigenous peoples in North America, increasingly more in South America, and I think even in Taiwan and Asia and so forth. And I think those are important. When I ask them about Africa, you get weird looks. I'm like, they're like South Africa, like I don't know, you ever heard of apartheid? Long history of colonialism there, settler colonialism in particular, Kenya, Zimbabwe. I mean, the list goes on and on. And there has to be some intellectual connection between, I'm thinking more diasporically here, Black studies, diaspora, critiques of colonialism, development of decolonial thought and theory, and how that can or should connect with Indigenous studies in North America, which it really has not. I mean, I see some wild things like, oh, we're going to look at Emmanuel Wallerstein. And I'm just like, why? Like, there are plenty of Black thinkers in the diaspora who have critiques of not only anti-Blackness, but clearly colonialism, or develop thoughts around decolonization. Right. So for me, there's so much to connect those things that I might just write the book. I have thoughts about it anyway.
Might as well. I mean, you've written all the other books. You should just.
I think this is a book. But if someone else wants to write it, cool. I'll write you an endorsement, no problem. But yeah, I think that's another challenge I might take on in the next 4 to 5 years. The relationship between decolonial thought and how it influenced Indigenous studies scholars, but specifically for Black diasporic decolonial thinkers.
I think that would be a really important book. So I do hope that you or someone else writes that book, because I think that is particularly important now. And as we think more about, and there is more, at least in the academy, acknowledgement, right, of the impacts, the lasting impacts of colonization and settler colonialism, and not just here, but abroad and other places. And that's something that I think, at least it seems to me, and maybe this is just a reflection of being in Madison, right? But like, I didn't hear as much about that when I was an undergrad as it comes up now. And the acknowledgement of its existence and its impact, I think that's a very important contribution to make to that.
And the simple fact that those Africans, our ancestors kidnapped, those are Indigenous peoples.
Yes.
Like, I don't know why this is and I'm not talking about ADOS or FBAs. You know, this podcast might get canceled after this. But I mean, like, anyway, but our ancestors from the continent were Indigenous people. They brought culture, religion, spiritual practices, customs, cosmologies that were not just completely erased. I mean, Dr. Smitherman has showcased this for a long time, the connection through sociolinguistics, through Ave or whatever folks are calling it now. I always call it Ebonics or Black English still. But those are still connection and like the relationship between the diaspora an indigenous linguistic practice that
Mhm.
still persists in all of our communities today. And making those connections, I think, is still a vital thing also for Black studies.
I agree. And I mean, obviously, we both got a lot of exposure to and learned a lot about those sociolinguistic connections through Dr. Smitherman. But I also think I've been thinking a lot too about like the food connections and being able to think about like the foodways is really interesting too, because there's a lot of similar things that happen like in these traditions. And then we think about like histories and things that are passed down and taken seriously. Like it's the language and it's also these distinct food practices and preparations and things like that. Um, yeah. That's just something I've been thinking about a lot lately.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert in that by any means, but there are a lot of connections that have been explored but need to be explored further. Um, there's a book, of course, I read in a history class. A book a week. I know folks are getting away from that.
Yeah.
Um, uh, it's a scholar, I think Judith Carney, and it was just talking about rice farming practices that
Mhm.
are brought to the Americas that are very similar to what persisted well into the 19th century. So, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of stuff. The Gullah Geechee. There's so many cool things that have been explored. Well, there's probably a lot more that could be explored.
And when you start exploring them, it also provides perspective to push back against like just the movement towards anti-history that's happening, like the just denial of basic facts, right? Like enslaved Africans that were kidnapped and brought here had skills that literally cultivated the this country in a way that led to it being rich and powerful for so long. Like those rice growing practices, those were brought from kidnapped enslaved Africans.
Yeah, the erasure of history and discussion of race, gender, and so forth is wild. What's happening right now to witness. I mean, you log into social media and you just see something like, is that true? But I have the skills to go verify certain things too. If I have a question,
Yeah. That's
um,
yeah. That's something that has I think that we also have to think about not just as a field and I know that people are thinking about this and this is something that is vitally important and I know that a lot of especially libraries and librarians are emphasizing this, but just like misinformation and disinformation and like just basic information literacy skills, like being able to fact check something and not just believing it because somebody put a TikTok ad on it or somebody published an article on it. And because it's out there in print, now people think that it's real. And that has been the lack of preparation for students to deal with the amount of misinformation that is currently available, I think is a real challenge.
yeah, I mean, the narrative of Kamala Harris locking up Black men at such a high rate, which I have seen repeated over and over. And my nephew texted me about this like a week or two ago, and I had to do a little bit of digging just to like double and triple check. I'm like, well, this is not true. Uh, but he and even other people in my family, I've seen this repeated over
Mhm.
and over and over, and I'm like, but this is not true. But who has like a researcher for an uncle for like especially young kids or family members that they can kind of call or text and like, is this true? Did this happen?
Mhm.
And maybe I don't know, but I know people to ask, or I have the skills to go research to figure this out, and that is scary to me.
Yeah. You saying something doesn't just make it true. And that's not how this should work. You can't decide that this is your truth and that truth is now applicable across all situations and circumstances when it's just factually inaccurate.
Yeah, you got even folks be trying to philosophize on social. I'm like, well, the premise is wrong. The facts are everything's wrong. But then they just like reject it by like, well, you didn't prove what you said was true. And I know you don't read books. I know that for a fact. This is clear based on what you're saying right now. But the thing that kills me even, and I know academics, we have a problem. We can be very arrogant and the whole sort of thing. But and we have disagreements with our peers in our fields too. I think a general populace doesn't quite understand that. Like I disagree with things I wrote 5 years ago. I had an article come out last year that I wrote a while ago, but like I think 7 years ago that just came out. I thought about changing it, and I was like, no. This is what I was thinking at the time. I completely and vehemently disagree with myself, but I'll let it rock. And so someone can say he changed his position on this, which is true. But any intellectual, when you encounter new information, will change your thoughts about something. But this is what I was thinking 7 years ago. But, shout out to the editor for not publishing this on time.
That's a long time. That feels like it's a little bit longer than the standard publication timeline. 7 years feels a little bit long. A little bit long.
But it's okay, though. It's out, and someone be like, this doesn't make sense. And he ain't said this. I ain't never heard him write this. I'm like, well, this is what I thought 7, 8 years ago, whatever that was.
I think what you said, like, about, like, pointing out which feels more obvious when you're in these spaces than it probably does when you're not in them. That, academics disagree with each other all the time, and their ideas evolve and change and shift over time as more information is acquired. Situations change, circumstances change, the lived reality that we are all facing changes. So in thinking about, sorry, but I think that that's one of the things about the history of Black studies that isn't necessarily as talked about or emphasized, right? Like, if we think about prior to the official, like, institutionalization of the fields, you have, like, Du Bois and Woodson and Washington, and, like, they didn't agree on, like, there were literal, like, debates, right? Like, that is what it was. It was, like, literally them going at each other, like, nah, you're...
Du Bois wrote a Euphoria like diss of Booker T. Washington after he died in 1950.
Just so he couldn't respond.
I was like that. You don't like him, do you? So for the youngest listening, this was before Drake and Kendrick. This was like Du Bois and Washington. They had real beef.
Yeah, real. Yeah. Maybe some of that is also, like, more needed to be emphasized. Like, we can have these debates and still agree on the fundamental reality of basic facts.
Yeah, I think we're losing the point of just basic facts. Like, I don't think they disagreed about basic facts about Black people oppressed. Yes. Now, your approach to doing this is just completely wrong, and I'm going to talk bad about you after you die. But basic facts are increasingly non-existent, basic agreements.
What a fun time this is. So, on that note, what interests you and excites you about the future of the field?
I think more sort of cross-disciplinary thing. By that I mean increasing works, although I suppose it's controversy, but between, for example, Black and Indigenous Studies, although there are folks who might be considered themselves Afro-pessimists, and Indigenous scholars critiquing them. It's always a blend of anti-blackness and anti-native things happening in that particular blend of the conversation. But there's also the one that I would consider myself in, people trying to create an impasse between Black and Indigenous studies for really not only educational purposes, but a political purpose of abolition, liberation, and so forth. So those things for me are very exciting. We need more. I mean, more stuff around pop culture, more stuff from the diaspora about this particular relationship, more history outside of the, say, 5 tribes, Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole, and the enslavement of Black people. That history is important, but we need way more, like, just outside of that as well, with the different collaborations, where there are Afro-Indigenous peoples trying to coalesce, like, just more history, more cultural studies, and also more things in the contemporary, beyond popular culture. So I'm working with a group called BLISS, Black Liberation and Indigenous Sovereignty, and they are really trying to bridge Black and Indigenous peoples around issues around reparations, for example, and try to create a bridge between the two, right? And so that's increasingly where I'm at now, and just trying to get people together. I mean, in my world, it would be, what can tribal nations do to do massive adoptions of Black people who are in their territories, for example? My tribe, Saginaw Chippewa, there's a clan system, and you always had a clan that determined your role in society, but you also, they developed clans for people who are adopted into the tribe. What would it look like for tribal nations to adopt Black people in their territory? And whatever your protocols are, whatever that adoption looks like, maybe you have to create something new. Never be afraid to create something new. Regional gatherings, like, in Poetic Justice with Tupac and them are like, cousin, right? You just showed up to a random like family reunion, what that still can absolutely work to this day. And you might be related in some capacity.
Yeah, I think there are some factors that come into play on how well that's going to work for you, but I do think that it could happen.
So, kind of regional gatherings, and getting our elders together, Black and Indigenous elders, talk about history, culture, talk about disagreements outside of the purview of white supremacy. I'm not saying white people can't be there, but you got to be a cool white person that knows when to chill and fall back. And don't center yourself. Sometimes, hey, you might be able to chill, but you got to chill and be quiet sometimes. And getting multiple generations, our young people, so they learn about history with some well-seasoned food.
Yes.
Like, food is always, one of my elders always told me, food is an important thing to bring people together. But it has to be well seasoned.
Yes.
So we have a good time. We can eat, chill, have a full belly. Get some vegan food for the vegans. For the vegetarian, all the diets, gluten-free, all that stuff. But watching things together, listening to music together. But you really need community and developing kinship with one another. And so that's kind of the things I'm trying to imagine and work on, this sort of Black and Indigenous future. For me, that's a vision, not only for Black studies, but for Indigenous studies. But it has to exist kind of outside of academia too, and developing those spaces and making those connections. Because academia is cool in a lot of ways, but it can curtail mass movements and mobilization. And especially something like this, because bless my peers, but they're going to start talking about ideas that nobody really cares about. Like we're focused on the
Hypothetical,
liberation part.
theoretical.
And I'm not talking about being anti-intellectual. I'm just like, we're focused on something different here. We're debating the same ideas, perhaps using a slightly different language, though.
Yeah. That's one of the things that like has been very interesting to me because I've been in a couple different fields. I've been all over the place. Um, it's like everybody's talking about the same thing. Y'all just called it this and they called it that. But like we're all talking about the same thing. So let's come together and talk about something other than what we call it.
Or someone trying to rename something.
Yeah.
That's one of my peers right now, and I'm like, this is basically the same thing. You just put a new preceding word.
You gotta coin the term. You gotta that's important. You coin the term.
You could use the same term. Just talk about your analysis. So often you don't need a new term for things sometimes.
Yeah, but
welcome to academia.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I always enjoy talking to you. We don't do it enough. You want to say anything about your work that you're doing now or the book that just dropped?
I rarely talk about books unless I really have to. I just drop. But so, Rethinking the Red Power Movement with my co-author Sam Hitchma just came out at the end of June, and it looks at the long history of the Red Power Movement. So, Red Power Movement is typically thought of from roughly 1968, from the founding of the American Indian Movement, to about 1980, 1977, 1980. But we look at preceding movements and trying to think of the Red Power movement as a sort of a longer movement across the 20th century, and then bleeding into the contemporary. So, talking about popular culture. We also talk about Black and Indigenous relations during the 1970s period, which is often a ignored point in thinking about the Red Power movement as well. So it's a very teachable book. It's a short book. So if you need to add something to a course from the 70s, even if you want to take out chapters in the contemporary, this book is perfect for that course. So students are not burdened with so much reading. I know we're so concerned about that. It would be perfect for books on social movements in the 60s and 70s. Just a really overall short, digestible book that I think would be really fantastic for teaching. And
Great.
The last book, which I have to finish, I got like 2,000 words left. Maybe less than that, actually. I think it's like 500. It's called Black Liberation, Indigenous Sovereignty, Notes on the Possibilities of Freedom. And it's looking at the relationship between reparations for Black people and land back or land returns for Indigenous peoples, and trying to envision a future of Black and Indigenous liberation. So who knows how people like it? Once it's out, it's out. But it'll be coming out with Haymarket. Not exactly sure. Probably within the next year or so. But I'm almost done with the draft, and I'll give it to the editors and let them do their thing.
Well, I'm excited about that one. And I'm also excited to think about the integration of the Red Power movement into some of the courses that I teach. So anytime I assign your reading, students always love it. So
well, that's good to hear. You never know if they think it's boring or not.
No, they tend to like it. And sometimes I'll just take short things. Like I've assigned your note on language quite a bit in my writing courses. And that always seems to resonate with them. But
I'll have a new one in this later book. We'll see how that one goes.
Any final thought or anything you want to leave out on?
People keep reading more, keep researching, and make sure we leave the world a better place for the next generation.
Let's make sure there's a world to leave here. Yes. Thank you so much, Kyle.
Of course.